Well, today we're going to do something wild and crazy, uh, much too ambitious, but that's the way we're going to do it. We're going to try to look at how the world religions, or at least some of them, look at life after death and raise the question, how did the early Christian movement encounter the world religions? Well, as we're going to see a little bit later, the main world religion that early Christianity contended with, aside from Judaism, was a form of Greek, either mythology or Platonism and stuff like that. So we'll get to that at the end. But in the meantime, let's think about the world religions dealing with this dilemma of human life, which is we seem to be caught up in dual problems of human failure and sinfulness and wrongdoing. And then ultimately, the problem that confronts all humans, which is our demise, our death. So, world religions in general try to deal with both uh, our mistakes and our destiny. And that's probably at the heart of what most world religions are about. And we'll see this played out again and again. One of the great things about studying for this class is that many of the critics of world religions will say that some people just kind of have an evolutionary view of the world religions. They started here in primitive animism and spirits and magic and demons, and then kind of elevated itself through time to monotheism and all that sort of evolutionary thing. And most of the scholars will now say that's not the way the world religions develop. They're really kind of very diverse and diffuse, and they don't start down here at a low plane and then get higher, nor do they start up here at this high plane and devolve into whatever. They're really all over the map. So I want to say that up front, that when the world religions are really studied, you realize their enormous diversity. But two things that hold them all together is this: we have the problem of human failure, and we have the problem of human destiny, that we all seem to draw our last breath. And then what? And the world religions are incredibly curious about what is next. I put that quote from Rabelais, that very funny French satirist, who was also a monk, by the way, who said that, he felt like he was approaching the quote, great perhaps. And a lot of the world religions have that sense about them, that there's this great perhaps on the other side of the grave. So let's take a look at that. If you look at the really ancient religions, and how do you discover what's in the ancient religions? Well, it's really mainly artifacts and things like that. Archaeologists will dig down and see what's there. One of the things that is curious about these very ancient primitive people, Stone Age people, is this fact that they buried the dead. Now, just think about that for a moment. Some of you have been watching the fires that have been happening in cremating the bodies in India. We'll come to Hinduism in just a moment, but you'll note that in India it's very important to cremate a body so that its spirit lifts up into the heavens. In the ancient Stone Age world, you buried the bodies, and you often put artifacts into the grave so that the person would be what? Prepared for the next stage after death. Sometimes they were buried in a fetal position. Sometimes they were buried facing east, looking forward to the rising of the sun someday. But in all of those world religions that they can trace back to the Stone Age and Paleo, the Neanderthals, etc., the what strikes the archaeologists is this: that they buried the dead. They didn't just dispose of the dead willy-nilly. And that points to something, that they maybe see something further in the future. Now, where we see this most obviously and most dramatically and grandiosely, of course, is Egypt. where when you look at who gets buried, well, who gets buried? Well, the top of the pyramid folks, the pharaohs and the upper court. But remember, in those tombs, they often would sacrifice the wife, maybe if she hadn't died already, and the servants, and you put all kinds of artifacts in those secret chambers so that when the next day arose, as it were, they'd have something to serve them, someone to serve them, some implements to carry on their life together. So that the burial of the pharaohs in those pyramids pointed toward a hope. Now, in Egyptian lore, the idea was dying into the day. It wasn't the dark night. It was dying into the day. Why? Because you would be reunited with that dying and rising god, Osiris. That god of the vegetation that dies in the winter and rises in the spring. And death was being reunited with Osiris, the god of the dead, and then the god of the living. So Egyptian lore and practice in those enormous pyramids, again, point to something beyond death. Some of you know that I taught a course, I just finished up at UNM on Roman Catholic history in the United States. And we started with Franciscans coming up from Mexico into New Mexico and confronting the native people's religion, the Pueblo religion, which you're aware, those of you who studied New Mexican history, was a form of Kachina religion. And I, being from Texas, had never had the privilege of studying New Mexican history. So one of the things that I enjoyed so much this past 6 months is digging deeper into New Mexico history, and especially the confrontation between the Franciscan priests and the Pueblo Kachina religion. And some of you may know that the Spaniards got here really in the late 1500s. And the Kachina religion had been brought up apparently from the south, and then it was only 200 or 300 years old in New Mexico when the Franciscans confronted them. And the Kachinas are kind of an interesting spirit. They're sort of intermediaries between the living on top of the earth and the spirits that are beneath the earth, the gods that rule the nature. And the Kachinas are sort of intermediary spirits. And that's why you can dress up as a Kachina in the dances. Or you might go into a kiva and there'd be a hole in the middle of the kiva, the round circular place of ceremonies, and the sipapu in the middle, is where there's this intersection between the Kachinas going above ground to humans and going down into the earth where the gods are, the gods of the vegetation, gods of various kinds. And the Kachinas are something of a reminder that we move between life above ground and life below ground. And the Kachina sort of are those intermediaries. The Franciscans had a lot of trouble with them. They tried to suppress them and see them as almost pagan gods. Others tried to translate them into becoming something like saints that would become intercessors between those on the earth and those below the earth. So for me, it was just great to study the Kachina religion and realize that you can go to the dances now and they're a little different than they were, I'm sure, when the Franciscans first came. But still there's this notion that there's an intermediary spirit between the living and the dead. The dead who are in fact not dead, they become ancestral spirits that continue to encourage those above ground, so to speak. So one book that you might be interested in is written by UNM professor of history named John Kessel. Some of you may know him, John Kessel. He wrote a book called Pueblos, Spaniards and the Kingdom of New Mexico. And this is not too long. It's about 190 pages, but it's a terrific history of how the Franciscans interacted with the Pueblo people and their views of life after death. It's another example that most every world religion, virtually every one of them, has some sense that we need to attend to these two problems: human misconduct and sin, and human destiny, what happens to us after death. Let me stop there before I go on. We've talked about some primitive world religions and how they saw things, including way back in the Stone Age, and then of course the Egyptians, and then moving quickly forward to the Kachina world. Maybe some of you have some observations or questions or thoughts so far. Okay, then let's move to Hinduism and Buddhism. Some of you know I've told several of you that I'm been asked to teach a course in world religions at UNM this fall. So I've been sort of up to my neck and sort of now beginning to read for the world religions. And I taught world religions a number of years ago at CNM, but now I'm kind of re-gearing for all that. So I've been thinking a lot about the relationship of Hinduism and Buddhism, both of which attend to these twin problems of human misconduct and then human destiny. And there are many, many ways in which these religions are similar. Of course, one is they both grew out of the nation of India. The Indus Valley on the west side of India is the sort of the origin of the name of Hinduism. And then, of course, uh, uh, Buddhism grows out of kind of an area around Nepal in the eastern part of India, where the Ganges rivers empties into the Bay of Bengal. And so these two parts of India are the origins of Hinduism, the sort of the western side, and that came about probably 3,500 years ago or earlier with the Vedic texts, et cetera. I'm not going into that. And then, of course, Buddha, Siddhartha, was a real human being, an individual, and he lived about 600 years thereabouts before Jesus. Okay. So Hinduism has many, many origins. We're not sure exactly who wrote what, etc. Buddhism has a singular origin with Siddhartha Gautama, who was a particular person, experienced enlightenment, and the rest they say is history. Now, these two religions are related because the Buddha started off in the Hindu world and then moved out of it. They share a lot in common. And one of the most important things they share in common is this concern about what happens to you when you die. And the thing that they share in common is this: some notion of reincarnation, the transmigration of souls. Now, Hinduism has a lot of stuff that Buddhism sort of broke away from. For instance, Hindu priests and the caste system, the Brahmins and all that stuff. Buddhism didn't want much to do with that. Multiple gods in Hinduism, Buddhism didn't want to do with all that. In fact, Buddhism, some will argue there's either a singular God or no God at all. So you don't actually need a particular deity to make Buddhism work. Hinduism is filled with a multiplicity of gods, and in that sense, it's very, very different. So I would say Buddhism is a kind of reform movement in Hinduism in this sense. You don't need Brahmin priests. You deal with your own enlightenment. There's a kind of equality of souls there. You don't need a multiplicity of gods, and you certainly don't need the caste system in Buddhism. And one big difference in Hinduism and Buddhism is this. In Hinduism, there's the notion of Atman, the soul, the individual soul, the divine that is within me, ultimately wants to unite with Brahman, the high God of Hinduism. So the goal here is what? The God in me unites with the God over all. In Buddhism, the idea is that the soul is sort of an illusion, that really when you die, ultimately your goal is what? To merge into like a drop of water into the ocean. So there's a kind of merging where the individualism of Hinduism is lost, and you have a sort of a pantheistic oneness. I think I've told y'all many times my favorite Buddhist joke of a Buddhist who goes up to a hot dog stand in Central Park and says, uh, "Make me one with everything." Okay, so that's my Buddhist joke for this morning. Okay, uh, Hinduism, the Atman, the soul, unites and kind of has a ongoing continuity. All right, now here's the key point. Both Buddhism and Hinduism believe that you should live a kind of dharma, that is a law, a rule that dominates the universe. And your life will be judged by how you conform yourself to dharma. And the things that you do right are good. Good karma is produced. That is, good results of your actions. The things that you do wrong become bad karma. And so ultimately, when you die, there's sort of a judgment on how much good karma is over against bad karma. And then in your next life, your soul moves on to the next world and the next life, and you will be assessed a position in the world. Now, uh, follow this. This is kind of important. In Hinduism, those caste systems, those four caste systems, you get placed in those caste systems on the basis of your quote karmic uh, uh, results of your life. And only the folks at the top in the Brahmin caste can ultimately aspire to what they call moksha, which is getting off of this wheel of rebirth. So in Hinduism, there's a kind of a literally a pecking system, and the bottom caste is called the outcast, right? That's the group that Gandhi tried to retrieve, and now it's actually illegal in India to have someone thrown into the quote outcast. It's not legal, but it's probably just a practice that people do. All right, here's the point. In Buddhism, anyone from any sphere of life can experience enlightenment, and that leads to nirvana, which gets you off the wheel of rebirth. So, in both instances, in Hinduism and Buddhism, what is the goal? To get off this continual wheel of rebirth where you have to sort of do it again in order to reach either moksha in Hinduism or nirvana in Buddhism, where the wheel of suffering, the wheel of sinfulness, and the wheel of regret finally comes to an end and there's peace at last. Okay. But my point is, Hinduism has a kind of almost a stair step, caste system to get there. In Buddhism, no, it can be anyone, anytime, any place who goes through that enlightenment. Nirvana for Buddhism, moksha for Hinduism. Um, so that's kind of Buddhism, Hinduism 101. It certainly doesn't cover the whole point, but the point is, it's about the fact that your soul has to go through multiple lives in order to finally reach your destination. Some have wondered, is this similar to sort of the Catholic notion of purgatory? Let me quickly do a quick aside on purgatory, and you ask yourself if it's the same. You know, purgatory in a Roman Catholic tradition was this. It was like when you died, there were three doors, right? One door, hell, one door, heaven, and then this third door of uh, where you would enter into what I've called an upwardly inclined car wash. And there's going to be some time in there where you're going to have a lot of the dross and mud sort of cleaned off your soul. And then eventually, purgatory always points upward. But, you know, it's going to be a hard road. By the way, those of you who've read Dante's uh, trilogy, you know, the purgatory is by far the most interesting. Anyway, a lot of tough climbs in there to finally get to the destination. By the way, you know, when Luther complained about purgatory in 1517, he complained about it for several reasons. One was that the preacher for the indulgences, I'll explain indulgences in just a moment, Tetzel, who came to Wittenberg, he was a legate from the Vatican, to explain to people how they could help build St. Peter's Cathedral. And here's how you could do it. You could buy indulgences that would do what? Reduce the time your beloved was spending in purgatory. Now, again, what Luther said was, what do you mean time? When you're gone, when you're dead, time is a non-factor. So he objected first on the basis of time. Then Tetzel said, and if you'll put money into the coffer, when the song went like this, when the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And Luther said, what's this? How can money have an impact on someone who's in purgatory? And then third, Tetzel said, and then the Pope will grant your beloved a full indulgence, and they can go from, you know, get out of jail free and quickly move up the incline of the upwardly inclined car wash and get to heaven quicker. And Luther says, how could anyone, a pope or anybody else, have any influence on what happens to the soul after death? So you see, purgatory was combined with what? Fundraising. And that made it especially onerous to Luther. So I'm not sure that purgatory in that sense is the same or exactly of what Buddhism and Hinduism mean by the wheel of rebirth. Karma in Hinduism and Buddhism is something you yourself have to work out in new lives. By the way, my favorite karma joke, it's not a joke, actually, it's an actual event. In about the 1980s, some thieves broke into a lab in Boston, and they were testing very highly contagious diseases. And the thieves broke into the lab and they realized they didn't have anything to steal. So they just got a bat and just broke up all the test tubes and destroyed everything. And of course, what? Exposed themselves to all those diseases. And the announcer on radio said to those thieves who went in there, I would suggest you go to the hospital because right now you're experiencing instant karma. You know, you're getting the results of your actions immediately, right? So I'm not sure that we should compare the Catholic notions of purgatory with the wheel of rebirth. They're somewhat related, but they're different because in karma, you have to do your own thing in the next life and hopefully get better. That's a lot of information. Let me stop and see if you have some comments or suggestions or improvements. Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
A question.
Sure.
So the notion of hell, like the idea that there's these three doors, hell, purgatory, and heaven.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talked about the Hinduism and Buddhism, I mean, it seems that hell is quite a different configuration.
Yeah.
Than their experience. So
Yeah, it really is. Because really, Hinduism and Buddhism, you literally have to work out your own salvation by experiencing the karmic results on your life for good and evil. And if you don't get it straight in this life, well, let's try it again, right? And purgatory is not so much starting a new life; it's dealing with, you might say, the accretions of your only life, right? And but you got to burn off that dross and those sins in order to get that upward car wash getting you to the door of heaven. So
But the concept of hell is quite different from even the worst that can happen in Hinduism and
yes,
Buddhism.
that's right. That's
Yeah.
true. Yeah. And remember, in Hinduism and Buddhism, the goal is what? A form of enlightenment that relieves you from human sin and suffering and anxiety and grasping after things and desiring things. It's cleansing one's soul of all of that stuff. Yeah.
Well, you know, when Moses had his last speech, presumably for the Israelites, the blessings and the curses,
Yeah.
isn't that sort of karmic?
Yeah, but I think in Moses' point, it was in this life you will see, you know, the results of your good and evil. Whereas in Hinduism and Buddhism, it's often in the next life. By the way, one quick thing that Hans Kuhn in his book Eternal Life points out, that what was one of the reasons for karma in Buddhist and Hindu thinking? It was this. It's a theodicy question, meaning this: you don't blame God for placing you in a bad caste or in a bad situation, or being reborn as a cockroach. You can only blame what? Yourself. So God is off the hook, and you yourself and I are to blame only. You know, instant karma, you busted up this lab, you know, you're going to pay the price yourself, right? Don't blame God for that. Hans Kuhn wonders if karma is sometimes ignoring what a gracious and providential God means to people. But we'll get to that in a moment, okay? All right. Let's do Greek religion. Homer and Plato are not on the same page. So, real quickly, Homer's view is that when you die, your soul goes into the place of the dead, Hades, and it's a place from which you cannot return. And it's a kind of a land of shadows and darkness. And one of the scenes that's most memorable in his Odyssey is when Achilles is so aggrieved that his great friend Patroclus has died trying to conquer Troy. And he's given the right to go down and visit Patroclus in the underworld. Hades is the Greek god who guards over the shadows of the dead, right? And Patroclus says, well, this is not a great place. I wouldn't recommend it. And I wish I could get out, but nobody gets out of here. And you remember in Greek mythology, about the only person who gets out of Hades is Persephone, who gets to come up and spend 6 months, you know, flourish, making the earth flourish, and then she has to go down and spend 6 months in the land of the dead. Well, she's about the only one who has access out. Once you get in, the door closes behind you, and it's kind of a dark and sad world. Okay, so just because the shadows, Patroclus' shadow, can talk to Achilles doesn't mean it's a great place for conversation, right? Now, when Plato comes along, that would have been the primary view of life after death in the Greek world. That is Homer. Homer was kind of the Bible, if you know, for the Greek world. Plato comes along, and guess what? Most scholars say that the Hindu notion of reincarnation, etc., had drifted across Iraq and Iran and got across into Turkey and eventually found its way where? Into Greece. And Plato adopts a kind of version of Hinduism and the transmigration of the soul. And here's what he changes entirely. One is the soul is eternal, and it comes from God, and it comes into the human being, and then it will live forever. The soul, in Plato's mind, is an energizer bunny that you just can't stop, right? And then when you die, there is a judgment. Yes, and it could be that you might go to a place like the Isles of the Blessed, which would be tantamount to what? Moksha or nirvana, etc. So Plato adopts a version of that notion of the transmigration of the soul. And how is the soul judged? Well, on its fidelity to the three forms: the good, the true, and the beautiful. And if you are a soul that has attended to those realities, then you will go back to something like the Isles of the Blessed, or go back to the forms where you could view forever the good and the true and the beautiful in a kind of a contemplative spirit. Okay. But it is very important for us to realize that when Plato was saying all this, he was going against kind of the Homeric Bible of the Iliad and the Odyssey, that sort of thing. One other source of inspiration for Plato might have been the mystery religions. Some of you remember last week or so, I said that one very common view about death in Greece was what? When you're dead, you're done. That's it, right? And the mystery religions were brought up probably from that same area of Turkey that said, no, if you go through a ritual, a dying and rising again ritual, then you will have the possibility of living again. This became, by the way, very popular among Roman soldiers who were facing death all the time in what was called the Mithra religions, where they would dig a cave and put a bull on top of this lattice work, and all the adherents would come into this cave. Then they would sacrifice the bull, and the blood would pour out of the bull's stomach. This is all very lovely, I know. And the blood of the bull would wash over the adherents in that little tomb. And then they would come out of the tomb, and they would be promised what? Life eternal, right? The dying and rising God. So that too might have influenced Plato. We're not sure. But here's what I want you to hear. In Plato, the soul is immortal. It's always existed. It started off viewing the forms of the good and the true and the beautiful in heaven, goes through the river of Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, and then comes into a body. And the body, the soma, is seen as a sema. Sema means prison house. It's the prison house of the soul. So you've got this eternal soul going into this bodily prison. And what is the goal of the soul? It's to remember what it was like when they were seeing the good and the true and the beautiful in its pre-existent state. And if it can remember it, then it should practice it. And so when the person dies, then what? The soul is released to go back where they came from, to the good and the true and the beautiful. Now, if it doesn't work out the first time and you didn't really kind of remember well enough, well, in Plato's mind, what? You get another shot at it. But again, as in Buddhism and Hinduism, getting another shot at it is not exactly seen as good news. It's seen as we used to say in elementary school, oh, he's having to redo the second grade. You know, they've got to redo that grade, right? So rebirth is not an award. It's rather, well, you didn't quite learn how to do your cursives right, or your addition tables. So you're going to have to try that again. All right. So that's Plato's vision. And when we get to this reading in the text in just a second, we'll see how Plato's theology influenced the Greek world that Paul confronts. Okay, one other quick world religion, and then we'll go to our readings. Some of you know that I'm doing a lecture this summer in July at the Oasis, and I hope all of you will come. We'll put it in the church newsletter. It's a lecture on Jesus and Mary and the Quran. So I've been up to my neck in the Quran. I read the Quran years ago, but I'm rereading the Quran. I'm using the Penguin Classic. I really recommend this. And so do you want a quick summary of the Quran? This won't take long. Here it is. God is one, and he's not an idol, and he's not a multiplicity of God. He's just one God. And God created everything, and God revealed God's self to Muhammad. And Muhammad is the seal of the prophets who follows all the Old Testament prophets and Jesus, and all of them are leading up to Muhammad. And what Muhammad is doing is bringing a warning and the good news to the Arabic people in their own tongue. And therefore, we need to unite together around this one God and this one prophet and be a new community of Islam, meaning those who have submitted their will to the one God. And every other view of God is wrong, especially a Christian notion of God, that God has a son. Real quick note, in the Arabic religions preceding Muhammad, one of the most common views of the gods, plural gods, was that they had sons and daughters. And so it's pretty clear that Muhammad has an incredibly negative view of any notion of incarnation of God as into a son, because it sounds an awful lot like those Arabic polytheisms that he was so totally opposed to. So this is the truth about God. And in that book, the Quran, I would say after those two notions, there's one God and Muhammad is his prophet. And by the way, that is the creedal affirmation of becoming a Muslim. Those two together. The third thing that I would say is the most prevalent in the Quran is the day of resurrection, which is the day of judgment, which is the day where all the souls are brought before God and they are assigned their destiny. And for those whose deeds of goodness outweigh the bad, remember the karma thing, they are ushered into paradise, which is seen largely as a garden with flowing rivers and with wonderful fruit and lovely scenery, right? Hell, on the other hand, is for those who haven't been righteous and good. And by the way, righteousness and goodness in the Quran goes like this: believe in one God, offer your prayers, and give your alms, and be kind to widows and orphans. Muhammad had been an orphan, and that plays itself out all the time in the Quran. So in the Quran, I would say to you that almost every page, I don't want to overstate it, virtually every page, there is something in here about the judgment of good and evil. Let me read you just one example, because there are literally hundreds of them. Okay. It says, says this: the trumpet will be blown. I'm in this chapter is called Yatsin. It's a long story. There are 114 surahs, and this surah or chapter is number 36. It says this: the trumpet will be blown, and behold, they will rise up from their graves and hasten to their Lord. Woe betide us, they will say. Who has roused us from our resting place? This is what the Lord of mercy promised. The apostles have told the truth, and with one blast they shall be gathered before God. On that day, no soul shall suffer the least injustice. You shall be rewarded according only to your deeds. On that day, the heirs of paradise will be busy with their joys. Peace will be spoken to them by the merciful God. But the others, this is the hell that you have promised. Burn in it this day on account of your unbelief. Folks, If you'd like to be reminded of your destiny, heaven or hell, the Quran is for you, because it says it virtually every single page. Now, I'm also reading a wonderful book called The Quran for Dummies. I really recommend this. And there is some possibility of maybe a purgatorial sort of version of the Quran, but I'm not going to go into that. It's too complicated. But here's what I want to say to you. The Quran is based on, in my opinion, three simple ideas. God is one, Muhammad is his messenger, and a day of reckoning is coming. And it says it ad nauseum. Now, having grown up on that kind of preaching, I kind of understand that. But I get it when people get a little tired of that, and etc. Okay, so let me stop here. We've covered a ton of ground, and I want to end up with two readings from Paul. Your thoughts. Here's the big picture I want to suggest. The big picture is virtually all the world religions deal with these two problems: human misconduct and human destiny. And they deal with it in quite different ways, but still, that's what they're concerned about. Your thoughts? Okay, so what I'd like to do is end up with Paul going to Athens, and he's confronting a group of philosophers on Mars Hill, which is right near the Acropolis. And it's kind of a little hill just below the big hill of the Acropolis. And this is what happens. Paul is standing before them in verse 22, 17:22. Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription to an unknown God. What therefore you worship is unknown, this I proclaim to you, that God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. For from one ancestor he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth, and he allotted the times of their existence and the boundaries of the places where they would live, so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone or image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. While God has overlooked the times of human ignorance, now God commands all people everywhere to repent, because God has fixed a day on which we will have the world judged in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed. And of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. Well, that's the showstopper, because the next verse says this: when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some scoffed, but others said, well, we'll hear you again about this someday. The resurrection, the word in Greek to them sounded like a god, the God of resurrection, as though he was preaching about the God of resurrection. So what would have made them sort of stumble on that? Well, because in their mind, in the Greek world, either when you're dead, you're done, or when you're dead, you go to the land of the shadows like Patroclus and you can't get out, or you're a Platonist who says, well, when you die, you either go back to the forms from which you came, or you get to do it again and redo this life so that you get better at it. And here Paul is saying something different. It's not either one of those three. It's this fourth option, right? And so you're wondering, what did Paul mean by that? Well, look finally in our last verse today at 2 Corinthians 4, which is, in my mind, one of the best phrases in Paul's writings about what he means by the resurrection. This is starting, I love this. This is 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 5:10. So this is fabulous. I love this reading. So we do not lose heart. Even though our outer nature is wasting away, our inner nature is being renewed day by day. For this slight momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all measure, because we look not to what can be seen, but at what cannot be seen. For what can be seen is temporary, but what cannot be seen is eternal. For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed with our heavenly dwelling, if indeed, when we have taken it off, we will not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan under our burden, because we wish not to be unclothed, but to be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee. So we are always confident, even though we know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord. For we walk by faith, not by sight. Yes, we do have confidence, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So whether we are at home or away, we make it our aim to please him. For all of us must appear before the judgment seat of Christ, so that each may receive recompense for what has been done in the body, whether good or evil. One of the things that I want to stress about this reading is that Paul does not posit there any kind of eternal soul. He rather sees the body as a kind of a tent, a kind of a temporary dwelling in which we have this spirit within us. And when we die, it's as though you fold the tent and we then put on a new tent given from God. It's as though the soul cannot be unclothed. There's no such thing as, quote, pure soul. There's always this soul in this new tent, this new body. That's what Paul means by the resurrection of the body. And what is the body about? It's about identity and it's about relationship. So that we don't become like a drop of water dissolving into the ocean. Rather, we have our identity. I'm still Frank, and I have the capacity to relate to you, my fellow sisters and brothers in light. Okay. So Paul's view is not that we sort of inherit this eternal soul. Oscar Kuhlman, in his book, Resurrection of the Body or Immortality of the Soul, says this: if we posit for ourselves a kind of eternal soul, we're really talking sort of Hinduism, in the sense that the Atman in me is related to the Brahman that's eternal. And Kuhlman says that makes us little divinities. It basically says, look, I've got a Energizer bunny within me that nobody can stamp out. I become a kind of little God. And what Kuhlman points out is that resurrection of the body means you need a new tent. You need new clothing, and you can't devise that for yourself. It's all gift, it's all grace. So God does this. Remember Ezekiel 37, Valley of Dry Bones? God creates the new possibility for life. Anyway, this is a little bit of Oscar Kuhlman. We could say much more about it, but let me stop here and see where your thinking is going on all this. There's an awful lot today, isn't it?